I walked into the conference room clutching the plastic badge he had just ordered security to seize. He believed he was evicting a meaningless wife from his life, never suspecting I was the sole person with the power to shut down this entire tower. As his lawyer smirked, I laid a thin envelope on the mahogany table. He thought he was ending a marriage, but he had actually just signed the death warrant for his career. My name is Evelyn Hart, and at 34 years old, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room that smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. Across the mahogany table sat my husband, Graham Cole. To his right was his mother, a woman who wore pearls like armor, and to his left sat his new media consultant, a 20-something brunette named Sienna, whose smile looked more like a baring of teeth. They did not look like people attending a divorce settlement. They looked like they were waiting for the curtain to rise on a victory parade. Graham's lawyer, a man named Sterling who seemed to believe volume was a substitute for competence, slid a document toward me across the polished wood. "We believe this is a generous offer. Ms. Hart," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Considering your position as a standard administrative employee, you have made no significant financial contribution to the Falconridge Group. You were merely support staff, a background character." I glanced at the paperwork. They were offering me nothing but the 5-year-old sedan I drove to work and a clean break. No alimony, no division of assets, just a dismissal. "We want this done quickly." Sterling continued. "Sign today, take the car, and Graham will agree not to pursue legal fees for the time you have wasted." I did not reach for the pen. I just looked at Graham. He was leaning back in his chair, checking his watch as if he had a golf tee time to make. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and empty of the warmth that had tricked me into marrying him 3 years ago. "Don't drag this out." "Evelyn," Graham said, "I already called security. They deactivated your access badge at 8 o'clock this morning. Your personal items are in a box at the front desk. You don't belong here anymore." I remained silent. My gaze drifted past him to the wall behind his head. A massive steel logo of the Falconridge Group hung there, gleaming under the recessed lighting. It was a symbol of power, of legacy, and of family. To them, it was the kingdom they were finally purging of a peasant. Graham's mother let out a short, sharp laugh. "I told you. Graham. The girl was always just hired help. She actually thought she was family because she wore a ring. It is pathetic." "Is there any response from the respondent?" the court-appointed mediator asked, looking at me with pity. He clearly saw a defeated woman, crushed by a powerful husband and his high-priced legal team. Graham sneered, leaning forward to whisper loudly to Sienna, "She has nothing. She is nothing. She always was." The room went quiet, waiting for my tears, waiting for the begging. Instead, I reached into my tote bag. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out a single thin manila envelope. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the silence. I placed the envelope in the center of the table, right on top of the insulting settlement offer. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor they expected, "I suggest you look at this because Graham just made a critical error." Graham rolled his eyes. "What is this? Another love letter? A plea for mercy?" "No," I said. "It is proof that you just fired the wrong person." Sterling reached out to grab the envelope, his face flushing with annoyance. "Objection. This was not in discovery. We are not entertaining last-minute theatrics." "I would read it if I were you," I said, my eyes locking onto Graham's. The mediator took the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the single document inside. He adjusted his glasses. As he read the first line, his eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper, his face draining of color. The air in the room shifted instantly. It was the feeling of a grenade pin hitting the floor. Graham noticed the mediator's reaction and his smirk faltered. What is it?" I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat on the cold wood. "You wanted this to be quick." "Graham," I asked softly. "Fine. We can make it quick. But when you walk out of this room, you are going to remember today. You will not remember it as the day you got your freedom. You will remember it as the day you personally signed the death certificate for your entire career." I let the chaos of the conference room fade into a dull roar as my mind drifted back 4 years to a humid afternoon in the convention center of Marrowgate. It was an internal recruitment fair for Falconridge, a mixer designed to make lower-level employees feel like they were part of the bigger picture. I was standing by the stale donuts, wearing a gray cardigan that made me look invisible, clutching a clipboard for the operations department. That was when Graham walked up to me. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, radiating the kind of golden boy energy that usually sucked the air out of a room. He did not ask about my job. He did not ask about my degree. He just looked at me with an intensity that felt like a spotlight and said, "You have the eyes of someone who will believe in me." It was a line. Of course, I knew that now. But back then, to a woman who had spent her life trying to blend into the beige walls of corporate hallways, it felt like being seen. Graham was the rising star of the strategy department, hungry for power and desperate for an audience. I was the quiet, efficient worker bee in operations. We fell into a rhythm terrifyingly fast. He loved me because I listened. He loved me because I was a blank screen upon which he could project his own greatness. "We are going to run this place one day." "Evie," he would whisper to me late at night, his hand tracing the line of my jaw. "You and me against the dinosaurs. We are a team. We are going to take what is ours." I believed him. I believed in the we. But there was one thing I held back, a secret that sat in my chest like a heavy stone. Graham did not know that I already owned Falconridge. My grandmother had left me the controlling interest in the entire conglomerate via a blind trust, but her will came with a strict, non-negotiable stipulation. I had to work as a regular entry-level employee for exactly 3 years. I had to scrub floors metaphorically, file paperwork, and suffer the indignities of the corporate ladder so that I would, in her words, understand the value of the labor I commanded. I did not tell Graham because I was terrified. I was scared he would fall in love with the position, not the woman. I did not want to be the boss's kid in a company rife with jealousy. I wanted to be earned. When he proposed 6 months later, it felt like a victory for true love. But the cracks appeared almost immediately. At our engagement party, amidst the clinking of cheap champagne flutes, his mother cornered me. She looked at my off-the-rack dress with polite disdain. "It is a sweet match, I suppose," she said, swirling her drink. "But tell me, dear, what does your family actually have? Whose name are the assets in 'We have enough'?" I had replied, my voice small. She had just hummed, a sound of pure disapproval, and walked away. A week before the wedding, I presented Graham with a prenuptial agreement. It was drafted by the trust's high-powered lawyers, designed to protect the legacy and forbid any spouse from interfering with assets held under the testamentary trust. To Graham, it must have looked like a joke, a poor girl trying to protect her meager savings. "It is just standard procedure," I told him, trying to keep my hands from shaking as I handed him the pen. My grandmother was particular about paperwork. "Whatever makes you happy, babe," he had said, signing it without even reading the second page. "I am the one bringing home the bacon anyway, right?" He laughed then. I forced a smile. After the wedding, the shift was subtle at first, then undeniable. The word "we" began to evaporate from his vocabulary, replaced entirely by "I." He stopped asking about my day in operations. He started referring to my job as logistics and back-end, stepping over me conversationally as if I were a piece of furniture. When I offered insight on a merger, he would pat my hand and smile condescendingly. Leave the thinking to the executives. Evie, he would say, you just keep the trains running on time. I stayed silent. I told myself to be patient. I told myself, just a little more time. Once the 3 years are up, I will tell him, and he will be proud of what I hid for us. I was a fool. I thought my silence was protecting our future. I did not realize that my silence was actually a mirror, and for the last 3 years, it had been reflecting exactly who Graham Cole really was. The suffocation began at home, specifically with the click of a laptop lid snapping shut the second I entered the room. Graham had always been careless with his devices, leaving them open on the kitchen island like invitations to his mind, but suddenly, he was fortified behind complex passwords and biometric locks. Yet, the hypocrisy was breathtaking. While he locked me out of his digital life, he still pushed physical paperwork across the breakfast table toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Sign this requisition form for me, will you?" he would say, checking his reflection in the toaster oven. "I am late for the strategy meeting, and I do not have time to log into the portal. Just use your clearance. It is faster." I signed them. I always signed them. I was the dutiful wife, the efficient employee. But as I stamped my name next to his requests, I began to notice where the money was going. In operations, I had access to the raw data of the company's spending, a privilege Graham seemed to have forgotten I possessed. I saw the client development budget ballooning by 300% in a single month. There were receipts for dinners at the Gilded Fork, $500 on a Tuesday, $600 on a Thursday. On those nights, Graham had texted me claiming he was eating cold pizza in the conference room. Then came the whispers. The break room at Falcon Ridge was a hive of information if you knew how to be invisible, and I had perfected the art of blending into the wallpaper. "Graham is practically living in Sienna Vale's office," a junior analyst whispered to her friend while the coffee machine hissed. "I heard his mother brought her in personally, called her a necessary upgrade for the brand." I met Sienna the next day near the elevators. She was everything I was not: sharp, glossy, and terrifyingly articulate. She wore a suit that likely cost more than my first car. When Graham introduced us, she did not offer a hand to shake. She just tilted her head, scanning me like I was a smudge on a pristine window. "Oh, you must be—" "Eve," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Or is it Emily Graham is always so vague about the details at home?" "It is Evelyn," I said, clutching my files to my chest. "Right," she drawled, already looking past me to press the elevator button. "Well, try not to wait up for us. We have a crisis to manage." The walls closed in tighter when Graham's mother started visiting our house 3 times a week. She would walk through our living room, touching surfaces with a grimace. "This furniture is quaint," she said one evening, picking at a loose thread on a throw pillow. "But really, Graham needs a sanctuary that reflects his trajectory. You simply do not have the eye for the Falcon Ridge aesthetic, do you? You are too domestic." Graham did not defend me. Instead, he began suggesting I slow down at work. "I think operations is getting too stressful for you, babe," he said one night, pouring himself a glass of wine and neglecting to offer me one. "Why not transfer to the archives department? It is in the basement. Quiet. No pressure. You could relax." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Archives was a data dead zone. Transferring there would strip me of my security clearance and my view of the company's cash flow. He was not trying to help me relax. He was trying to blind me. I refused, and that was when the digital gaslighting began. I would arrive at work to find my terminal settings changed. My audit logs showed logins at 2 in the morning from my account, referencing files I had never touched. When I checked the security history, the entries would vanish minutes later, wiped clean as if they had never existed. The trap snapped shut on a rainy Tuesday. I was summoned to Human Resources. The director of HR, a woman who usually smiled at me, sat stone-faced behind her desk. "We have a problem, Evelyn," she said, sliding a printout across the desk. We found an email sent from your account leaking confidential project specs to a competitor. I looked at the paper. The timestamp was 4 in the afternoon on a Sunday, a time I was grocery shopping. But the chilling part was not the time. It was the language. The email used phrases like "per your request" and "strategic alignment." I did not write like that. Graham did, and so did Sienna. "I did not send this," I said, my voice shaking. "The digital footprint says you did," she replied coldly. "We are opening a formal investigation." If I were you, I would be very careful. I walked out of that office feeling the ground dissolve beneath my feet. I realized then that this was not just about an affair. Graham was not just sleeping with the new PR director. He and his mother were building a scaffold, and they were going to hang me from it to cover their own tracks. They were not just breaking my heart, they were actively framing me for corporate espionage. I met Rowan Pike in the back corner of a diner 3 towns away from the Falcon Ridge headquarters. He was the legal custodian of my grandmother's trust, a man whose suits were as sharp as his mind, and the only person alive who knew that the woman sipping cheap coffee across from him actually owned the company she was being pushed out of. "You cannot say a word yet. Evelyn," Rowan said, his voice low and urgent. "You have 7 days left on the probationary period. If you reveal your identity now, before the 3-year mark, Graham's lawyers will twist it. They will accuse you of corporate espionage and insider trading. They will say you infiltrated the company under false pretenses to manipulate the stock value." "They are already framing me." "Rowan," I whispered, gripping the ceramic mug until my knuckles turned white. "They are planting evidence on my computer. They are going to fire me for cause." "Let them," Rowan said, his eyes hard. "Let them dig a hole so deep they can never climb out of it. But you need to find out why they are rushing this. Divorce is one thing, but this coordinated attack, they are hiding something massive." I went back to work the next day, not as a heartbroken wife, but as a forensic auditor. I used the remaining access I had to dig into the archives of the shared drive. I started pulling expense reports and cross-referencing them with the new contracts Sienna had brought in. That was when I found the smoking gun. It was a consulting agreement with a shell company called Vale Meridian PR. The monthly retainer was $50,000 for crisis management, a crisis that did not exist until Sienna arrived, but the real horror was in the addendum. Tucked away on the last page was a revenue-sharing clause giving a 15% commission on all vendor renegotiations to an entity identified only by the initials G.C. "Graham Cole," I murmured to the empty room. Sienna was not just a mistress. She was a money laundering front, and she was not working alone. I found meeting minutes from an unofficial family advisory committee chaired by my mother-in-law. She was forcing long-standing vendors to break their contracts and re-sign with new, more expensive suppliers, skimming the difference off the top. But the knife in my heart twisted when I looked at the approval logs for these transactions. They had not used Graham's digital signature. They had used mine. Every fraudulent contract, every inflated invoice, every kickback scheme had been authorized using my credentials. If this house of cards collapsed, Graham would walk away clean, and I would be the one going to prison for embezzlement. I needed undeniable proof that Graham was the one pulling the strings behind my back. I set a trap. I created a dummy file on the secure server titled Executive Compensation Review, Confidential. I filled it with fake data about pending salary cuts for the board of directors. Then, I set the permissions so that only 2 user accounts could view it, mine and Graham's. 2 days later, the entire office was buzzing. A screenshot of the file had been leaked to a gossip blog that covered the industry. "Did you see this? A colleague hissed at me by the water cooler. Someone leaked the board's salary cuts." I walked back to my desk, my heart pounding with a cold, grim satisfaction. I had not opened the file since creating it. The only other person who could have accessed it and subsequently leaked it to create chaos was Graham. He had taken the bait, proving he had backdoor access to my workspace. I called Rowan from a burner phone in the parking lot. I have him, I said. He is using my account to run the scams and to leak data. Good, Rowan replied. Now we need the final nail. We need Graham to go on record, legally and publicly, stating that you have zero rights to Falconridge. We need him to be so arrogant that he signs a declaration stripping you of everything. Why, I asked. Because, Rowan said, his voice curling with anticipation. When the trust activates next week, that declaration will be the proof that he acted with malice. It will prove he tried to defraud the true owner. It turns a divorce case into a criminal conspiracy. I hung up and looked at the looming glass tower of Falconridge. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back in there and let them win. I had to let Graham think he had crushed me. I had to play the role of the defeated, discarded wife so that he would feel safe enough to sign his own destruction. The end of my marriage did not happen in our bedroom or a therapist's office. It happened on the asphalt of the company parking lot, beneath the hum of the halogen security lights and the unblinking eye of a surveillance camera. Graham did not even have the decency to do it in private. He intercepted me as I walked toward my car, thrusting a thick packet of legal documents against my chest. "Sign it," Graham said, his voice flat and devoid of the affection that had once defined my world. "I cannot carry you anymore. Evelyn, I am going places where you simply do not fit." I stood frozen, the papers heavy in my hands. Before I could speak, a shadow detached itself from the pillar behind him. It was his mother. She stood tall and victorious, looking not at me, but past me, raising her voice just enough for the security guard in the booth to hear. "We are replacing the operations manager immediately," she announced, dusting imaginary lint from her coat. "This girl is slowing down the process. Falconridge requires competence, not charity." It was a public execution. They were stripping me of my title and my dignity in one breath. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to ask how they could be so cruel, but the sound of clicking heels silenced me. Sienna walked up, sliding her arm through Graham's. She looked radiant, glowing with the thrill of the coup she had helped orchestrate, but my eyes snagged on her wrist. Hanging loosely on her arm was a vintage silver watch, a watch I had saved for 6 months to buy for Graham on our first anniversary. I had engraved the back with "Forever Yours." Now, it was hers. "Ready to go?" Honey Sienna asked, tilting her head and flashing a smile that was all teeth. She said the pet name slowly, deliberately, making sure I felt the weight of the replacement. I tried to step around them toward the building, acting on instinct to go clear my desk, but the glass doors did not open. I tapped my badge against the reader. The light flashed red. Access denied. I looked through the glass. Inside the lobby, people I had worked with for 3 years, people I had shared lunches and birthdays with, lowered their heads. No one looked at me. I was already a ghost. Graham stepped closer, lowering his voice so the guard could not hear the blackmail. "I will give you a little money," he hissed. $10,000. Enough to get out of the city. But you have to sign the non-disclosure agreement and disappear. If you fight me, if you try to claim wrongful termination, I will push that HR file about the data leak to the press. You will never work in this industry again. He was not just leaving me, he was ensuring I had no ground to stand on. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, but when I pulled into the driveway of the house we had bought together, my key would not turn in the lock. The tumblers were stiff. He had changed the locks. I walked around to the garage. The door was open, and inside, my life had been reduced to 4 cardboard boxes. They had not even packed everything, just the things they deemed mine. Old clothes, paperback books, cheap toiletries. On the side of the top box, someone had written in thick black marker E.H. outside entity. I sank to the concrete floor and began to sift through the debris of my life. That was when I found it. Tucked inside a stack of my old college textbooks was a single sheet of paper that did not belong. It was a photocopy of a legal document. Specifically, it was a page from my grandmother's trust fund agreement, the one detailing the asset transfer date. My breath hitched. This document was supposed to be sealed in a lawyer's vault. The only way Graham could have this was if he had hired someone to dig into my background, deep enough to bypass standard privacy laws. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They did not just fall out of love with me. They had been hunting. They had found a scent of money, a rumor of power, and they had been trying to find the source. They assumed that by divorcing me and forcing a settlement, they might scare me into revealing the money to save myself. Or perhaps they thought kicking me out would force me to liquidate assets they could then claim were marital property. They were not just cruel, they were thieves. I sat there in the cold garage for a long time. I could have cried. I could have screamed until the neighbors called the police. But as I stared at that photocopy, the tears dried up before they could fall. I stood up, dusting the dirt off my skirt. I picked up the manila envelope containing the evidence I had gathered, the expense reports, the logs, the undeniable proof of their fraud. Okay, I whispered to the empty garage. You want me to go, I will go, but I will leave. In a way that ensures you never forget my name. I checked into the Starlight Motel, a crumbling establishment near the bus depot where the neon sign buzzed with the sound of dying flies. I requested room 204 because it faced the street. Once inside, I sat on the lumpy mattress and sent a text message to a mutual friend, knowing exactly how fast gossip traveled in our circle. I wrote that I was broke, terrified, and staying at the motel until I could afford a bus ticket out of state. It was a pathetic admission, exactly the kind of white flag Graham needed to see to lower his guard. The next morning, Rowan arranged a mediation session at a neutral law office. When I walked in, I saw that Graham had turned a legal formality into a spectator sport. He was not alone. His mother sat in the window, inspecting her manicure, while Sienna was scrolling through her phone. Looking bored, Sterling, his lawyer, pointed to a chair opposite them. We are here to finalize the separation, Sterling said, sliding a thick document toward me. This is the non-disclosure agreement. It prohibits you from discussing Falcon Ridge, Mr. Cole, or the circumstances of your departure. In exchange, you get the settlement check. I picked up the pen, letting my hand tremble just enough to sell the performance. I will sign it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I need one assurance. I do not want to be liable for the budget overages in the department. I cannot afford to be sued later. Graham scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Nobody is going to sue you. Evelyn, we just want you gone. Please, I insisted, pulling a single sheet of paper from my bag. I prepared an addendum. It just states that all financial decisions, including the recent access to the accounts and vendor approvals, were done under your explicit direction. It clears my name from the internal audit. Graham snatched the paper from my hand. He barely glanced at it. To him, it was the desperate plea of a woman trying to avoid debt. He did not realize that the legal language in paragraph 3 terms like sole agency and direct supervision effectively transferred full legal liability for every fraudulent transaction from my login credentials to his authority. By signing it, he was confessing to being the architect of the embezzlement. If I sign this, will you leave the city today? Graham asked, uncapping his expensive fountain pen. Yes. I lied. He scribbled his signature with a flourish. There. You are absolved. Now get out of my life. I took the paper back, fighting the urge to smile. Then I turned to Sienna. And you, Ms. Vale, I said, keeping my eyes downcast. I need you to sign this service schedule. It confirms the dates you worked, so I can close out the operations log. I cannot leave the files open. Sienna rolled her eyes but took the clipboard. She signed next to the dates that perfectly aligned with the withdrawals of project funds. She had just created a paper trail linking her consulting firm directly to the stolen money. As I packed my bag, Graham's mother stood up, unable to resist one final twist of the knife. "It is better this way," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Falcon Ridge is ours. It belongs to the family. You were just visiting. You only married him to attach yourself to something significant." I tapped my pocket, where my phone was silently recording. In this state, with one-party consent laws, she had just provided the evidence of malice I needed to prove a conspiracy to disenfranchise a spouse. "I understand," I said softly. "I know my place now." I walked out of the building, the heavy glass doors closing behind me with a final thud. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Rowan. "It is done. The probationary period ends at midnight. Tomorrow. The trust activates." I returned to the motel room, but the smell of stale cigarettes no longer bothered me. I laid the documents on the cheap bedspread, the addendum with Graham's signature, the service schedule with Sienna's signature, the recording of his mother claiming ownership. It was a thin pile of paper, not nearly as thick as the criminal evidence file I would eventually build, but it was sharper. It was proof of ownership and proof of their intent to destroy me. They thought they had just paid me off to disappear. They had no idea that tomorrow I would not be the ex-wife begging for a bus ticket. I would be the majority shareholder walking in to clean house. The war for Falcon Ridge did not begin with a lawsuit. It began with a press release. Less than 24 hours after I walked out of that mediation room, Graham convened an emergency all-hands meeting. Through the grapevine of loyal former colleagues who were texting me under their desks, I learned that he stood at the head of the boardroom table and announced my termination due to gross ethical violations and breach of confidentiality. He did not stop there. Sienna leveraged her local media contacts to spin the narrative. By noon, a business blog in Marrowgate ran a headline: "Internal Sabotage Falcon Ridge Group ousts operations manager amidst data leak scandal." They were painting me as a disgruntled employee who had tried to sink the ship because her husband was too successful. I did not post a defense on social media. I did not call the reporter. Instead, I logged into my personal email and sent a single, high-priority message to the Director of Human Resources. "This is formal notice to preserve all server access logs, security footage, and digital entry records from the past 6 months. I will require these for the upcoming litigation." I hit send and waited. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the first crack in their armor appeared. Graham called me. His number flashed on my screen, a name that used to make me smile, but now just looked like a threat. I let it ring twice before answering. "Evelyn." His voice was tight, strained. "Look, we need to talk. I just got a call from the bank. I am busy packing. Graham," I said coldly. "Stop playing games," he snapped, though I could hear the tremor of panic beneath the anger. "The bank called about a bridge loan application. They want to verify the guarantor signature. It is signed with your initials, E.H. My blood ran cold, then immediately hot with rage. He had not just used my access, he had forged my signature on a loan document to cover the cash flow holes he had created. "I never signed a loan." "Graham," I said. I know, he said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "It was just a placeholder. Administrative error. I can fix it. But you need to tell them you authorized it verbally if they call you. If you don't, this becomes a fraud investigation." "A fraud investigation?" I asked, feigning innocence. "That sounds serious." "Evelyn, please," he hissed. "We can talk about this like adults. Meet me for dinner. I can increase the settlement." "You already spoke to me." "Graham," I replied. "You spoke to me when you ordered security to escort me out of the building. You do not get to speak to me again." I hung up. 30 minutes later, Rowan called. He sounded like a general who had just received word that the enemy had walked into an ambush. "The 3-year probationary period officially concluded last week," Rowan said. The trust is fully active, legally. You are no longer an employee on probation. You are the majority shareholder. Does Graham know I asked? No. In fact, his mother just tried to summon the Family Advisory Committee to vote on blocking my firm from reviewing the company financials. She thinks I am just a nuisance lawyer. She has no idea I represent the trust that holds the power to veto her entire existence. Let her try. I said, "Oh, it gets better," Rowan added. "Check social media." I opened the app and found a long, rambling post from Sienna. It was a tribute to resilience, talking about how hard it was to deal with toxic jealousy in the workplace. But in her arrogance, she had included a screenshot of a supportive email she had received from a vendor. The email header clearly showed the sender Vale Meridian PR. It was the same shell company name on the invoices I had found. She had just publicly linked herself to the firm receiving the embezzled funds. She just handed us the connection. I told Rowan. "Indeed," Rowan said, "which is why I just exercised the trust's right to call a special board meeting. It is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at the Falcon Ridge headquarters." I looked at the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. They thought I was hiding in a motel room, counting my pennies. They thought they had erased me. "I will be there," I said. "Security will try to stop you," Rowan warned. "Let them try," I answered. I tossed the phone onto the bed and looked at the cheap mirror on the wall. The woman staring back was not the tired, heartbroken wife who had cried in the garage. She was the owner. I picked up the thin manila envelope. It was not heavy, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. "Good," I whispered to the empty room. "I will go back. But this time, they will have to stand up when I walk in." The security guard at the front desk, a man named Miller who had greeted me every morning for 3 years, put a hand up to stop me. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I am sorry, Ms. Hart," Miller said, avoiding my eyes. "Mr. Cole put your name on the restricted list this morning. I cannot let you up if you do not leave. I have to call the police." I did not argue. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper embossed with a gold seal. It was a letter of authorization from the Hart Family Trust. "I understand your orders." "Miller," I said softly, "but please read the authorization clause at the bottom. It supersedes any directive given by executive management." Miller squinted at the paper. He read the lines, then looked at the seal, and finally looked at me with wide eyes. The color drained from his face. Without a word, he swiped his MasterCard over the turnstile sensor and the gate beeped open. He stood straighter than I had ever seen him stand. "Go right ahead, ma'am," he said. I took the elevator to the top floor. The double doors to the boardroom were closed, but I could hear Graham's voice booming from inside. I pushed the doors open. They swung inward with a heavy thud that silenced the room instantly. Graham was standing at the head of the table, mid-gesture. On the projection screen behind him were the words Falcon Ridge 2.0 Restructuring for Growth. He looked like a king holding court. His mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while the rest of the board members listened intently. Graham froze when he saw me. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "You are not allowed in here," Graham shouted, pointing a finger at the door. "Security, get her out." I walked calmly toward the table, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. "You are mistaken, Graham," I said, my voice steady. "You just do not have the authority to kick me out. I am the acting CEO," he spat. "You are a fired employee." Rowan, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up. He walked to the front of the table and cleared his throat. "Actually, that is not entirely accurate," Rowan said. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, allow me to formally introduce Ms. Evelyn Hart. She is the sole beneficiary and voting controller of the Hart Family Trust." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Graham let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. That is ridiculous. This company belongs to my family. We built it. Rowan shook his head slowly. No, Graham, your family manages it. The Hart Trust has owned the controlling interest in Falconridge for 40 years. You just married the owner. Graham looked at me, his eyes searching for the lie, but finding only the cold truth. She is lying. He stammered. She is just a low-level operations manager. She doesn't own anything, is she? Rowan asked. He slid the NDA addendum across the polished table. Then can you explain this document? Is that your signature? Graham. Did you not sign a legal affirmation yesterday stating that you personally directed all financial movements in her department, that you authorized every transaction? Graham stared at the paper. It was the trap he had walked into because he was too arrogant to read the fine print. Sienna stood up, her face pale. This is absurd. Those transactions were for legitimate media consulting. Rowan tossed a stack of invoices onto the table. They fanned out like a deck of cards. $50,000 a month, Rowan recited, paid to a shell company registered to your personal home address. For a crisis management strategy that did not exist until you created the crisis yourself. The board members began to murmur. The wolves were smelling blood, and they were turning their eyes toward Graham. Graham's mother slammed her hand on the table, her composure shattering. This is a setup, that girl. She set a trap. She deceived my son. I looked at her, meeting her gaze for the first time without fear. No, I said. I just stopped being the silent one. The chairman of the board, a gray-haired man who had always ignored me in the hallways, stood up. He looked at the evidence, then at Graham. In light of this information, the chairman said, his voice grave, and the revelation regarding ownership, the board moves to suspend Graham Cole effective immediately, pending a full forensic investigation. Graham turned to me. His face was a mask of pure horror. The realization of what he had lost was finally hitting him. You, he whispered, his voice trembling. You ruined my life. You destroyed everything. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No, Graham, I replied. You signed it yourself. Graham did not go quietly into the night. Instead, he panicked and made the most dangerous move of his life. 2 days after the board meeting, he filed a civil lawsuit against me for fraudulent inducement of marriage, claiming I had concealed my identity to entrap him and manipulate the company from the shadows. He successfully petitioned a judge for an emergency injunction to temporarily freeze my voting rights until the matter was resolved. He thinks he bought himself time, Rowan said, looking over the filing in my hotel room. But he just did the one thing we needed him to do. By suing you over the trust, he has made the trust document a matter of public court record. He just waived his own privacy. File the countersuit, I said, looking at the city skyline. Everything. The forged signature on the bank loan, the embezzlement scheme, the defamation regarding the HR leak, and attach the log files he signed off on. The war escalated instantly. I released the forensic audit of the Family Advisory Committee to the remaining board members. That was when the first domino fell. Arthur Vance, a senior board member who had always fiercely defended Graham's mother, suddenly went silent. My data showed why. He had been receiving a 2% consulting fee on every vendor contract my mother-in-law renegotiated. I confronted him in a private video call before the next hearing. I can release these wire transfers to the SEC, Arthur. I told him calmly. Or you can testify about who organized the kickback scheme. It was not me. Arthur stammered, his face gray on the screen. Eleanor, Graham's mother. She said it was standard family business. She said you were just an obstacle. He flipped within the hour. Meanwhile, the media storm broke. Sienna tried to get ahead of the story, booking an interview with a local news station to paint me as a manipulative heiress who played with people's lives. But as she spoke about professional integrity, Rowan leaked the service contracts of her firm, Vale Meridian PR. The dates showed she was billing Falconridge for crisis management 3 months before any crisis existed. She was not fixing problems. She was being paid to create them. The internet turned on her overnight. Desperate, Graham requested a private settlement meeting. He arrived at my lawyer's office looking like a man who had not slept in a week. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweaty charm that made my stomach turn. "Evelyn, look," he said, leaning across the table, trying to catch my hand. "This has gone too far. We are destroying the stock price. Why don't we stop? We can start over. Imagine the power couple we could be. You have the shares. I have the vision. We can rule this city." I pulled my hand away as if he were burning me. "You tried to have me arrested for a data leak you orchestrated." I said. "I was scared," Graham cried out. "I did not know who you were, but now I know. I can treat you right this time. I promise." I looked him dead in the eye. "Answer one question. Graham, do you love me or do you love the thing you just found out I own?" He hesitated. That split second of silence was the loudest sound in the room. I love us," he stuttered. "Goodbye, Graham," I said. Standing up, the final blow came in the divorce court. The judge reviewed the evidence of Graham using corporate security to lock me out and the HR files to blackmail me. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, peering over his glasses, "using marital assets and corporate resources to fabricate a disciplinary record against your spouse to gain leverage in a settlement is not just unethical. It is an abuse of power that directly impacts the division of assets." Sensing the end, the alliance between Graham and his mother shattered. The bank froze the family advisory accounts due to the fraud investigation, cutting off her cash flow. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I watched as she turned on her son. "You promised me this was handled," she shrieked at Graham, not caring who heard. "You said she was a nobody. You said you could control her. Now I have federal investigators asking about my renovation fund. You were the one who told me to kick her out," Graham shouted back, his face purple. "You said she was dragging us down." They were tearing each other apart, revealing every secret they had kept. I stood at the end of the hallway, watching them self-destruct. I realized then that the climax of this revenge was not about me taking their money. It was about forcing them to scream the truth in the very halls where they had once whispered their lies. Graham walked into the final hearing wearing the smile of a man who believed he was bulletproof. He adjusted his tie and whispered something to his lawyer, likely a joke about how he was going to walk away with a settlement and his reputation intact. He truly believed that my ownership of the company was just a secret I had kept, not a weapon I could use. He thought he was fighting a divorce case, unaware that he was walking into a criminal indictment. I sat quietly next to Rowan. On the table before me lay the thin envelope I had carried since the day I was evicted. It was time to empty it. One by one, I laid the papers out on the plaintiff's table. The first was the certified declaration of voting rights from the Hart Family Trust. The second was the addendum to the non-disclosure agreement, the one Graham had signed without reading. The third was a stack of server access logs, and the fourth was the chain of invoices from Sienna's shell company. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Halloway, picked up the addendum. She looked over her reading glasses at Graham. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "you are under oath. Do you confirm that you personally directed the financial approvals within the operations department during the period in question, and that you revoked your wife's access to these systems?" Graham stood up, still confident. "No, Your Honor. My wife acted alone. I had no knowledge of her mismanagement." I signaled Rowan. He handed the judge the document Graham had signed in the mediation room. "Is this your signature?" "Mr. Cole," the judge asked. In this document, you explicitly claimed sole agency for those exact transactions to induce Ms. Hart to sign an NDA. Graham froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I did not stop there. I presented the final piece of the puzzle, the forensic report regarding the email that had accused me of leaking data. Your Honor, I said, standing up. The defense claims I was fired for a security breach. However, IT forensics traced the IP address of the device that sent the incriminating email. It did not come from my computer. It came from the administrative laptop assigned to the Chief Strategy Officer, Graham Cole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Graham had not just framed me, he had been clumsy enough to do it from his own machine. Graham's mother, sensing the walls closing in, stood up from the gallery. She was shaking, her composure completely shattered. It does not matter. She screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. We just needed the girl to disappear. She was ruining Falcon Ridge. We had to get her out. The judge slammed her gavel down, the sound like a gunshot. Order, Justice Holloway shouted. She looked at Graham's mother with icy contempt. Let the record show that the witness has admitted to a conspiracy to wrongfully terminate and disenfranchise the respondent. The ruling came down swiftly and mercilessly. The judge voided the non-disclosure agreement entirely, citing that it was procured through fraud and criminal intent. She issued an immediate restraining order barring Graham and his mother from accessing any Falcon Ridge systems or premises. Furthermore, she announced that the evidence of forged loan signatures and embezzlement would be forwarded to the district attorney for criminal investigation. In the divorce settlement, Graham received nothing, no alimony, no shares, no payout. In fact, he was ordered to pay my legal fees and damages for defamation of character. When the bailiff moved to escort them out, I did not smile, I did not cheer. I simply gathered my papers and walked past Graham. He looked small now, stripped of the corporate armor he had worn so arrogantly. You, he rasped, his eyes hollow. You destroyed my life. I stopped and looked him in the eye for the last time. No, Graham, I said softly. You said I did not belong in this company. You were right. I belong to its future. You belong to the past I just closed. I walked out of the courthouse and drove straight to the Falcon Ridge headquarters. This time, the security guards stood up and saluted as I walked through the glass doors. I went straight to the executive suite, not to sit on a throne, but to sign my first executive order. It was a directive to implement a whistleblower protection program for employees and to formally terminate the employment of Graham Cole, his mother, and Sienna Vale for cause. I stood by the window, looking out at the city of Marrowgate. I had entered this marriage wanting a family. I left it with an empire, and I knew that from this day forward, no one in this building would ever be made to feel invisible again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's chat. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people.